Hey guys! What's up? Welcome back to my channel, to this video. I'm very excited to talk about this topic today. So I have my notes to my side. I am ready to get started. Today's topic is Let the Boys Dance, I think is like what I'm going to title it. The pipeline I've noticed from super macho superhero to happy dancing guy, enjoying life, not worried about his intense masculinity. I have a few examples. I haven't seen anybody like make a video about this, but I've seen discussion about it on TikTok. So I do think like people are talking about it. It's happening. People are aware. So yeah, that's what we're here to do today. The thing that like kind of prompted me to actually make this was I watched Chicago for the first time a few weeks ago at this point. I did not realize that Richard Gere was in Chicago. I didn't realize that he sang. I didn't realize he did anything at all. Like all of my perception of Richard Gere was from Pretty Woman, the movies where he's in a suit and he's like a very serious guy. I started watching Chicago and it's like, the gun, oh yes we both, we both reach for the gun. Oh yes we both, reach for the gun, oh yes we both reach for the gun, I fucked that up so horribly. Haven't seen Chicago. I think it's good, so I recommend it. But it is like musical theater, but it's like really good musical theater. I'm trying to watch all of the Oscar Best Picture winners, so I just watched The Hurt Locker 2 nights ago. So I watched Chicago for that reason. So Richard Gere was kind of the idea that prompted it, but I've seen it being talked about for other people. So I think the best way to get this started is to just jump into examples I've seen. I do want to say like a little disclaimer. This is like based on my perception and what I have seen them in. So I'm not saying that like just because somebody did a superhero movie and then they did a movie or a play where they're singing and dancing. I'm not saying like that they are completely like switching into that typecast, if that makes sense. So just because they did a superhero movie and then a dancing movie doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't go back and do more superhero movies or do something else where they're like more playing into their masculinity, if that makes sense. No one is one-dimensional. The first one that I've seen talk about recently is Daniel Craig. Daniel Craig, if you don't know, is James Bond. So almost the stereotype of like strong masculine men, you know, pew-pewing and there's always a girl that he's saving. Over time, women have gotten more agency, especially within that genre. So like, I'm not a huge James Bond person, sorry, so I haven't really seen them. But I do think women are given a little bit more agency in James Bond movies now. I think he's more recently been doing the Knives Out movies. I haven't seen Glass Onion, but I have seen the first Knives Out movie. Daniel Craig's just playing this like southern detective who's like a little silly, a little goofy, and it's just like a totally different type of character than he's used to playing. And he's just like a happy, silly guy. So I've seen a lot of people talking online about how Daniel Craig just seems a lot happier. And obviously nobody actually knows celebrities, so like what the hell do we know? It seems that Daniel Craig seems more excited and more happy to do these kind of like wackier characters versus like dun dun. That's Mission Impossible. You know what I'm saying though? That's one example. I already talked about Richard Gere, so from Pretty Woman where he's like saving Julia Roberts from prostitution and being on the streets, and he's this big lawyer guy, to Chicago where he's again a lawyer, but he's a singing and dancing lawyer. Oh yes, who has the gun? Fans of Chicago are gonna be so pissed at me. Another one that I've heard a lot of discussion about is Hugh Jackman. I think those are like, Hugh Jackman and Daniel Craig are, this middle one was supposed to be Richard Gere, are the main ones that I've heard people talking about in regards to this kind of phenomenon. Hugh Jackman went from being the Wolverine, which I do think there's some drama around the Wolverine movies in terms of like how well they've done, their box office success. But I know he played Wolverine for a long time. He's been on Broadway in a musical called The Music Man, and it just looks really fun and joyful. So I've heard people say that like Hugh Jackman just seems so happy being on Broadway and like getting to do some tap, getting to do some like fun dance and singing. He was also in The Greatest Showman, which is a lot of like pizzazz, show, circusy stuff. Okay, a few more. I put Taron Egerton on here. Taron Egerton is known, I think probably most from Rocket Man, which is like, I think my second exposure to him. I've also seen him in Eddie the Eagle, but Taron Egerton, and this one I was kind of unsure about, but I did some research and I do think he qualifies. So he did The Kingsman, or just called Kingsman. I do remember seeing the previews though, like weirdly, I don't know what movie I went to, but I do have distinct memories of seeing previews for The Kingsman or Kingsman when I was going to see something. So I don't know why it stuck in my head, but it did. So Taron Egerton was, when he was younger, this movie's like quite a few years ago, playing like literally a secret agent. Like he's training to be an agent. So he did like these very serious pew pew bang bang movies. And he went over to, like, if you haven't seen Rocket Man is like one of the most like aggressive examples of this, I think. It is so, I mean, he's playing Elton John. Rocket Man is the story of like Elton John. So if you haven't seen Rocket Man, he's literally in dazzled costumes, he's in like big peacocky things, he is, you know, singing and dancing the whole entire time. And it's also like a very serious movie, so I don't want to like say it's not, but I do feel like Taron has moved towards some really fun, eccentric, happy singing movies. And that's just to say, like, as I was saying before, this isn't like typecasting anyone, because I know he just did I don't remember what it's called, I want to say Blackbird. He just did a like darker drama. So again, not completely, but interesting. One that where I thought it was interesting because it's almost the reverse. We have Tom Holland. So Tom Holland, I think one of his first things was playing Billy Elliot on Broadway. So obviously a lot of singing and dancing on Billy Elliot because it's about a boy who wants to do ballet. And now he's moved towards, you know, being Spider-Man, being part of the Marvel Universe. And he also did Uncharted, which I've seen the Spider-Mans and Uncharted. Interesting, because the video game is so good. Much to say about Uncharted, but another video maybe. Anyway, so Tom Holland's almost in the opposite, where he started doing more like, I think he's classically trained, or I know he did gymnastics and ballet, I believe, and so he did Billy Elliot, and then he kind of moved over into doing these superhero movies. So he's kind of the opposite, but I mean, I think Tom Holland in general is he appears quite soft in his demeanor. He seems relatively soft, so I think he's like a kinder version of Spider-Man. But anyways, that's getting into some detail. So there's like some outliers to this theory or this pipeline I've noticed. I did want to put in there an honorable mention of Andrew Garfield. I think similar to Tom Holland, maybe this is a Spider-Man thing. I don't think Andrew Garfield is a particularly like big macho person either, but I think he went from doing Hacksaw Ridge. The one I was actually thinking of though is his Spider-Man is like a bit more playboy-y, I think. Like I know people say he's like, his version of Spider-Man was too cool, so I do think he comes off like a little bit more macho in Spider-Man. Moving to things like Tick Tick Boom, where he's playing like a literal playwright and it's a musical, so he's singing and dancing and doing all of these things. So those are my examples I wanted to point out. So I do think there's quite a few to make it noticeable, and these are all like very big names, and a lot of these guys are quite masculine, I think. They're not having to disrupt that idea, that picture of masculinity, but they are allowing it to transform into something less toxic. So we will talk about toxic masculinity. It's like transforming into something more comfortable, I think, for everyone. Like as a woman, I much rather see that kind of performance, that kind of energy towards me than like, let's get into what this transition means. I think the biggest thing is how this is redefining. I hate to frame it as like a female gaze, because I think that I do like the idea of the female gaze and that transition from the male gaze, but I don't want to apply like problematic vocabulary to the scenario. So I guess I'm just saying this should have a role, I guess, that even like stereotypically masculine men are playing more, or that we are seeing more on TV. So I think like a good way to start this is just to talk about what toxic masculinity is. So I'm going to read you a definition really quick. Toxic masculinity is described as the adherence to traditional male gender roles that consequently stigmatize and limit the emotions boys and men may comfortably express while elevating other emotions such as anger. It is marked by economic, political, and social expectations that men seek and achieve dominance. Which I think that's a good definition. I'm happy with that definition. And I think I was really introduced to toxic masculinity once I started taking college classes. I know I took a sociology class where I think that's the first time I was ever introduced, but it's often spoken about when discussing like literature and poetry and stuff like that. So if you haven't been in a scenario like that, maybe you don't fully have like a strong grasp on toxic masculinity, which is, you know, totally fair. So that's why I think it's like good for us to talk about it here. When I was doing research for this video, I read this like really like a bad article. I just felt like I really missed the concept or the idea of what's happening right now. It said that like our favorite soft boys they're dabbling in female clothing and like femininity, and I just think that like completely misses the point that like this new idea of a man, I guess, or like this desirable man that we are moving towards, I think that has nothing to do with the fact some of them are wearing feminine clothing or unisex clothing. I think that's like super great, and I think that's really exciting that men are doing that. I don't think that's what's dissuading this idea of toxic masculinity. I do think it's more just like, this is like horrible but true, I think it's more like seeing women as equal is kind of what's doing it. So like allowing them to share the same amount of spotlight as men, or having equal roles, passing the fucking Bechdel test, things like that, I think are what's contributing to it. And I think like a huge part on like the male side is like being comfortable being like yourself. Playing characters in that sense too, that don't rely on being like super big and demeaning to other people and being loud and in charge, like just being normal people, being kind, being like happy and showing real emotion, feeling like you can cry, feeling like you can dance, feeling like you can sing. Just these like very simple things that I think have often been branded as feminine and just like are human, just like supernatural, super comma natural, not supernatural. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I just think saying that men are being feminine is like completely missing the point. I think men are just being more human in a way that they haven't been allowed to where women have. Okay, does that make sense? One more point I just wanted to make about this. I also just really like, especially in like interviews I've been seeing more lately, is when men are able to like express themselves in an intelligent way, because it shows that they're like able to visualize things and put themselves in scenarios that are not natural to them, being empathetic towards others, and you're understanding other people are living lives different from you. I think that is super sexy. And I think that has been another addition of like moving away from this toxic masculinity. Kind of moving on to like when we're talking about the past and how things have been and how men have been allowed to act in the past, so like these like really macho aggressive roles. There's been so many men who have come out like recently saying like how unsustainable that was for them and how they like felt like shit having to fit these certain roles. So a really good example of this is Zac Efron. I think this clip is like relatively well known, but there was that clip on his show, I can't remember what it's called, but I'll put it here. He did like a travel show where he traveled with his friend to different places and they tried different food and met different people, and he's eating at this one place and he talks about how when he was shooting Baywatch, he ate like no carbs. Like he was stuck to like this extremely strict diet so that you'd have like the perfect body, and how he felt like he could never do that again because it was so hard and so like heartbreaking and unsustainable for him to act that way. Another one is Taylor Lautner. He's been on podcasts, I think lately, talking about how like the portrayal of his body in media has really like messed with him.
It's a lot easier to have an unbelievable body when you're 17, 18, 19 years old.
Well, it wasn't easy though. Like the diet you were on, the amount of workouts
it was my
you had.
entire life. In New Moon, I was 175. So that wasn't my natural body.
He said that like the media was often showing pictures of him with where he doesn't have like an 8-pack, where he just has like a normal body, and how the media was just like, oh, he's lost it, he's really let himself go, and all of these things, like comparing pictures of him from like quote unquote now to Twilight, and how it just like really hurt him. Because like how was he supposed to like hold himself to that standard when it was taking like all of his time and all of his energy just to look like that? And it's like, for what? Like for who? I keep talking about social media a lot, but I mean, how can we not talk about social media? It's so important, it's so big right now. Just like we're seeing all of these people, we're more online than we've ever been. And we're just constantly shown all these super beautiful, super hot people. Like, how the hell can we hold ourselves to these standards? We're getting shown too much, I think. And as we all know, the internet is not real. People are not always as happy as they seem at living such a perfect life as it seems. But that's like what we're seeing, you know? Like, that is what we're seeing. So it's just a really high standard. I'm getting worked up. It's just a lot, you know? I think there's been this like perception. So like in media we've seen in the past, it's often like, if it's a group, it's like 3 men and a woman or 2 men and a woman. And then it's a main character who's male. And then there's like a female like love interest. So she's kind of like a main character, but she's definitely like a side character compared to the man. I think that's been like a very common makeup of particularly macho movies. So when I say, I think macho is maybe not the correct word for it, but I'm thinking like the John Wicks, I'm thinking James Bond, I'm thinking Mission Impossible. Those are like kind of the aggressive examples, but like any ensemble movie. I'm thinking Fast and Furious, Marvel movies, where it's like the Avengers and then Scarlett Johansson is in a like skin tight black jumpsuit. Movies like that, I think, where it's like usually a token woman filled with like a cast of men. Women are always like shown as wanting like the main character, even if he is like shown to be emotionally unavailable, kind of like cold and not giving her a whole lot, or she's giving him more than he's giving her. Well, I think we have our voices more than we ever have, where we're talking like, oh, see, that was like completely written by a man, and that's not at all how we feel. Like, we really don't like being these side characters who are only seen as flat and in love. Like, those are, you can either be boring or you can be in love. That's how it seems to be portrayed often in film. Trust me, I would know. I've watched a lot of fucking movies. That's like my big point, is like we're getting to see men be in these more like diverse, versatile roles, which is I think very exciting in general, especially when we're in the age of like the 100th Disney reboot and like everything being remade. I think it's really refreshing to see these new types of characterizations and roles for men. So I guess like my last thing I want to talk about is where I can see this going. It's on my mind that we tend to overcorrect in one direction. What I'm thinking of is like, if you think about like fashion, I think is a good way to visualize it. If you think about like how quickly fashion changes, and so we went from like the 2000s really gaudy fashion, like the Tumblr mustaches and all that bullshit, to like very sleek, clean girl, black and white aesthetic. So I think we do have a tendency to like completely sway in the opposite direction in many things, in media in general as well. If you think about like Instagram, like how we all had the fucking sepia filter, and now we're like moving more towards like unedited dumps. So we overcorrect, I guess is my point. So I'm worried that we could potentially overcorrect, moving from these movies that depict a lot of toxic masculinity to now moving to more like generally accepting and diverse and exciting and happy and fun, and allowing men to be dimensional as well as women be dimensional. I fear that we're moving from, you know, that we could zoom back. However, I want to say that in things that are like as big and I think as important as this, we tend to stay. So I hope this isn't like an overcharacterization, but I think the civil rights movement and forward, I think Black people have gotten more and more autonomy and more like screen time, I guess, or like they're like in things more, and same with like Asian and like other minorities. Obviously there's a lot of work to be done, but I do think like compared to like even 20 years ago, there's a lot more diversity. And I think that's also true for like LGBTQ plus, Happy Pride Month. Sexuality has become more like understood. Again, long way to go, but if you think back to however long ago, things have gotten better, and there's still I don't want to, I just want to like really put out there, there's so much work to be done, but compared to how things have been, we're getting queer storylines. There's becoming more and more and more. My whole point is trying to say is that I'm not getting across well is that like things are progressing and they're not reverting. So I do think it's possible for things not to revert. So I do think this could potentially be an important enough thing that it won't revert. Wow. I could have said that in like 10 words, and instead I said it in about 1,000,000. We're still kind of like in the big renaissance of like women's rights, hopefully, like hopefully where women have better rights and better representation. So I do think toxic masculinity, like I've been saying, masculinity and the patriarchy are like very intertwined. I don't know what that was. Part of patriarchy and changing that. I'm thinking that masculinity can also be transformed, and that's kind of what we're seeing, hopefully. So shout out to all my men. Shout out to Daniel Craig. Shout out to Hugh Jackman. Shout out to Taron Egerton. Shout out to everyone who is exploring, trying to be a little bit more open and a little bit more multidimensional. So thank you for watching my video. I've had like a lot of good discussion in my comment section lately, so feel free to comment and I will hopefully see you in there, and I think there's so much to say about this topic and I would love to talk about it. So thank you for watching. I will see you next time. I love you. Peace, love, and happiness. Goodbye.